This is Hog Farmer Chris from the Hog Farmers Charitable Foundation. And before you start listening to Red Zone in the Lab, check out our Amazon Smile, a simple way to support the Hog Farmers Charitable Foundation every time you shop, and it's no cost to you.
Welcome to a brand new season of the Red Zone in the Lab podcast, where nothing is off the table. We will be discussing entrepreneurship, education, Black history, health, movies, family, and of course, sports. So do yourself a favor, make sure you like, subscribe, and follow on all social media platforms: YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And of course, you can always visit us at redzoneinTheLab.com.
Welcome back. This is Red Zone in the Lab podcast, and I am Deuce. And entering the lab today, 980 Take Command podcast host Craig Hoffman. How is it doing today?
I'm good, Deuce. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you for joining us. So let's get this out the way. Congratulations. Newlywed, right?
Thank you.
Marriage.
Appreciate
it. How's that experience been these last few months?
It's been awesome, man. Married life is fantastic so far. I don't anticipate that changing. Saying so far, just because that's all I've gotten so far. But it's really been great. My fiance, now wife, we were lucky enough to spend a lot of time together from the time that we met because of the pandemic. And it's kind of the thing where you find out how much you really like somebody by immersion therapy. And turns out we like each other quite a bit. So married life has been great.
Yeah, I can tell on following you on Instagram how much you all love each other. So that's a good thing, man. It's a really good thing, man. So the Washington football franchise, the Braves, Redskins, Washington football team, Commanders. What's the history with you and them?
There's not really any. I joke around with folks sometimes. I'm a hired gun. I grew up in South Carolina. My family had season tickets to the Panthers. So I grew up going to games at Bank of America Stadium down there, and was working in Dallas looking to try to leave there and find something a little bit bigger for myself. And I got a call from someone I had known for years at that point, and he brought me up to 980 initially in 2015. And I've been here ever since. I love DC. It's where I consider home now. It's where I want to raise my family. Like, I have no intentions of leaving. I love DC. And obviously the team is incredibly interesting to cover. I don't know if it always engenders great feelings, but especially of the 7 years that I've been here, but there's no true ties in that way, which I think can help and hurt sometimes in the job. I think sometimes it helps me because I can truly be objective, and other times it's like, no, this is the thing that's important to the fans, and you gotta realize your audience. And so I'm always try to be sympathetic and empathetic to that as well. That there's folks that have cared about this team for generations and generations and generations. And while that's not me, that's ultimately my audience. And so, understanding how they think and feel is obviously super important.
Yeah, I think that's very important, especially as content creators, kind of understand your audience, what's your audience, and figure out what part of the audience you want to be a part of. Because a lot of times, some audiences you just don't want to be a part of, So I think that's very important. And then you not having those strong ties to the actual team can kind of, give people a better understanding of your point of view and where you're coming from. So you kind of gave us the rundown of, your path to being a content creator. But before 980, like before you got that phone call, what were you doing down south?
So I was working as an update anchor and board op, producer, talk show host, like kind of a little bit of everything. Monday through Friday, I was running the board and as a part of our two local shows on ESPN 103.3 in Dallas. So I got a chance to work with like Tim Calishaw every day, who obviously most folks know from Around the Horn, but he was hosting a daily show at the time. Ian Fitzsimmons, who's now with ESPN Radio nationally. Like, I get to work with some really good people. Yeah, Fitz is a funny guy. But I always, there's my one go-to Ian Fitzsimmons saying always is, Ian's the guy who taught me in terms of sports gambling, they don't air condition the desert because they lose. And that's something that always, when I try to, dip
I
into the
like
gambling
that.
field a little bit. I'm always got fits in the back of my head going, they don't
Mhm.
condition or air condition the desert because they lose. So I got to work with those guys down there, which is a really good learning experience. Got to host a weekend show. I was actually doing a lot of basketball stuff, Mavs magazine show every single week. And then came up here and obviously dove into the football heavy immediately as I was named beat reporter for 980 before going over to the Fan, and kind of the path that I think most of your listeners that know me will know that I've traveled the last 7 years.
Yeah, so let's get into some football. All right. So preseason expectations coming into the season. We have Carson Wentz. We understand Scott wants to run the Air Coryell offense. He wants to be able to go deep, push the ball down the field. So what were your expectations coming into this season before the 1-4 point mark?
I thought that they would be like a pretty mediocre team, a team that had a lot of explosive offensive potential, but wouldn't always reach it. They would have some ups and some downs. And I thought offensively and defensively, like I just thought they'd be really inconsistent because of their personnel. Carson being the main driver of the inconsistency, the variance, to use my co-host Logan Paulson's favorite term, the variance that they would ride offensively, and then defensively as well. Like there were some games where that pass rush and the front four were going to carry them because Allen and Payne and Sweat are that good. And at that point, we didn't know how soon it would be until Chase got back, and lo and behold, we're still waiting, but that's a different topic.
Yeah.
But also like the questions at linebacker and in the secondary was like, I don't know that week in, week out, they're going to be great. So the funny thing, the way the season has played out is they're kind of on path for exactly who I thought they'd be. They've taken a wild path to get there. But I thought they'd have these wild ups and downs and be a pretty inconsistent football team that ultimately landed somewhere between 7 and 9 wins.
All right, so now we're here. We get to that 1-4 mark. Carson Wentz breaks his thumb. He goes down. He's on the IR 4 weeks. Taylor Heineke is in, and now we're here. We also make the Brian Robinson comes back, right? At some point, WJ3 is benched. So now we go from that point to here. What's your take on the team and where they come from the 1-4 start to right now?
I think they're a good football team. I don't think they're a great football team. I think but like the thing is, Deuce, like the box that they put themselves in works for them. Like they are in this very now low variance box, which doesn't always feel it because Heineke can be so wildly up and down. But because of the style that they play, where they run a ton of plays, they own the clock. There's only so many possessions in a game. Teams can't really run away from them. They're not going to run away from anybody for a variety of reasons. And their defense is solidified since Jackson went out. And as long as St. Juste is healthy, like they're really good on that side of the ball. And so they're in between like 17 and 23 points, unless the Eagles want to fumble Ruski one at the end of the game and give them a free touchdown and let Casey Tuhill do a horrible gritty. And then they score 32.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah. And other than that, they're kind of between that 17 and 23. And the question is, can they keep the other team below that threshold? And it's a formula that's repeated itself enough times that I believe in it. I actually think it works for them. And I feel pretty good about their chances to be competitive against pretty much anybody. Like I wouldn't pick them against the best teams in the league. I think a team like Kansas City scares me the most because they can run out on anybody. And this team doesn't have the firepower to catch back up. And specifically, they don't have the O-line to be able to drop Taylor back and pass like that. But if they can stay within their formula, they can compete with anybody. And obviously, I think the best piece of evidence for that is the Eagles are 12-1 and the Commanders are the 1.
Right. And when you think about this team and how this offense is constructed and the game plan that we all of a sudden switch to go into, thus is one of the main things is our concern is be able to put up points fast. Because we get to that point to try to put up points quickly, we sputter, we get behind in the chains and here we go trying to do screens that we know we have no O-line personnel to really do for it to be effective. So that's where we are. So I wonder, looking at the Giants and how they came out on fire, how they focused on a run with Saquon and also with Daniel Jones before our game. Saquon was on pace to get 450 touches, which also including receiving. And that would have broke the record. And now he's hobbled, sore shoulder, and everything else that's going on. And now look where that offense is. So the only thing that I think our offense is different is that we have more than one back that can produce. And now Williams is starting to come on also to give those breaks. Yeah. So that's one of the main reasons why I think this can be a little more sustainable going down to the stretch run into the playoffs. But if we get down and we get behind the chains, that's where my concern grows the most.
No, and your concerns are placed correctly, in my opinion. The other big difference, though, obviously, is like we got receivers down here.
Oh yeah, we do.
Like,
most definitely.
Those three dudes change everything, and especially considering Scott's actually done a pretty good job this year of getting them touches in creative ways. Maybe not as much as everyone would like, because everyone wants to play Madden and call reverses every play. But that's obviously a little bit of an exaggeration. I'll give the fans a little bit more credit than that. But like we definitely do just run it more often. It's like, well, it's kind of hard to get those things right, and if they go wrong, like you look real dumb. So but they have done a good job of like, let's try to get a screen or reverse to Jahan. Obviously, Curtis being in the backfield more. They're running those screens for Terry, are just really making sure you get Terry his touches. And that is also like an underrated turning point of the season. It's like Taylor got the ball to Terry. Carson didn't. And that's good enough for me for why Taylor should stay the quarterback, because Terry's that dude. And so that and the versatility and the depth of the backs, like you're talking about, is 100% why it's more sustainable than a team like the Giants, who's living on much thinner ice. Now, what the Giants have is a quarterback who can really be a weapon running the ball. And in theory, Taylor can, but I don't think he's quite as good at it as a lot of fans seem to think. And also, I do think the fact that they didn't want to go to Howell very clearly probably caused them to pull the reins back on him a little bit. I am curious now that it's do or die crunch time and Carson's back as an insurance policy, if they cut him a little bit loose more in the run game. But I don't think they trust him. And it's not necessarily even just the injury thing. It's like they don't trust him to get hit and hold on to the football. And so because of the ball security stuff that has happened with him on occasion, I do think there's that's the other difference. And that goes to the game this weekend to kind of wrap this very long answer up, is like, if the Commanders can't control Jones in the run game and out on the edges, they're going to let the Giants hang around much longer than they should. This should be a fairly commanding win for Washington. It should have last time too, and they tied.
Exactly.
So having a better plan for Jones, that's a well-coached football team, and Dable and Wink Martindale and staff on both sides of the ball for them deserve a ton of credit. But Washington, now having seen that, having the extra bye week, they should have a much better plan for Jones. And if they do, the Giants are in real trouble because Saquon is wounded and they don't have really anybody else.
Yeah, and that's something that we saw the last Giants game. Is something that we haven't really seen. What I meant to say is not playing clean football, penalties, all those things. Because I think we had one drive of like 7 minutes and another drive of like 60 minutes leading in punts. Right, like we cannot do that, and we have enough trouble trying to put the ball in the end zone when we're down.
I remember Logan and I talking about that on Take Command. I think it was a total between the two drives of 23 plays for like 14, 18 off the clock and 0 points. And you're like, how is that even possible?
The calendar says that summer is ending soon, but we're still outside. So when it's time to hop in your ride, make sure you book the best mobile detailing service in the DMV, Miles Detailing. Call 240-273-4018 or contact on Instagram at Miles Detailing to book your service today. Mention Red Zone in the Lab podcast for 10% off detail services only. Ride in style with Miles Detailing, that is.
Welcome back to Red Zone in the Lab with Deuce.
What are your expectations from this upcoming game with the Giants all the way through Week 18?
I think they win this weekend. I think that it's not like a runaway game, but it's one where they do get out to a good start and are generally in control. That's how I think that it should go. We'll see. The Giants could throw some wrinkles at it. San Francisco honestly scares the daylights out of me. There's just so many factors that are bad, including the fact that San Francisco is really freaking good. Defensively, I think they can, everyone keeps waiting for the 4 turnover game from Heineke. That's the one. That's the one I've got circled going, that defense is so good, so confusing. They're so aggressive to the ball. And offensively, they do some stuff that I think could cause some trouble for this defense. So I think San Francisco is a bit of a wash. I think Cleveland's obviously very winnable. And not that San Francisco isn't, but you're also talking about West Coast trip after Sunday Night Football on a Saturday. It's a bad confluence of circumstances.
Christmas Eve.
Yeah, the whole thing. Cleveland, my thoughts on Deshaun Watson are well known. I hope nothing good ever happens to that man again. And I hope that includes the Commanders game. And so, if they can come out and handle business, Watson's still struggling from a sheer football standpoint, shut down Nick Chubb and then go from there. And then, the big wild card is week 18, because the Cowboys should have everything locked up as much as they can. That 5 seed, they're not going to be able to catch Philly probably. And so assuming that's all true, like, do you see Cooper Rush? And if so, can you handle your business? The Commanders might not have to. If they win 2 of the next 3, like, they probably don't need a win in week 18 either. So they're in great shape. But it really does come down. Football Outsider says if they win this weekend, it's 86% chance that they're in the playoffs. And it's like 20 something if they don't. So it really does come down to handling business this weekend. And while I think that there are every other game on the schedule is winnable, specifically the last 2, it really, because of the tiebreakers and everything, and the fact that the Giants are the other team you're kind of battling, it comes down to this weekend.
Do we see Wentz at all outside of injury to Taylor Heineke?
This is such a great question, Deuce. I really wish I knew the answer. I'm going to say no, because I think Taylor does enough to hold him off. However, if he starts turning the ball over like crazy against San Francisco, I think there's a very good chance you could. I'm going to say no, but I don't feel very good about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way that this team rallies behind, and it's just like you hear moxie, you hear all types of stuff to kind of describe what this guy brings to.
But it's also he doesn't take sacks. And
exactly.
That's way more important than the moxie and the other. Like, there is tangible stuff he does. And I feel like people focus so much on the intangibles because his story is really fun. It's like, no. He also doesn't take sacks, and he completes balls over the middle, and he throws to Terry McLaurin. Those are tangible things he does that are better than Carson Wentz.
And he throws the ball out of bounds. He does, he doesn't make the crazy mistakes. I mean, you do see those interceptions when you look at, you're like, what in the world? Like he's gonna give you those, but for the majority,
but people forget Carson gives you those too.
Exactly, and I think that's the thing about Washington and this area and these fan base. Backup is always the better quarterback, right?
It's not just here. I can tell you that much.
Right. Well, yeah. So let's talk about. I wanted to talk to you about Ron Rivera and year 4. Is there any way that you don't think he makes it to year 4? And then also kind of pivot, because you have taken a lot of heat on Twitter yesterday for your comments, and I would like for you to we can just talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Let me start with the year 4, year 5 thing first, because that's a pretty straightforward, simple answer. There's 0 chance he's not back next year. I guess I shouldn't say 0, because that's just how the world will laugh at me. But there's basically 0 chance. And that's strictly due to the ownership situation. Dan can't afford to fire Ron, even if he wanted to. And a new owner, even if things go great on the sale and it's done by March, you're not hiring a new coach or firing a coach, hiring a new one after free agency a month before the draft. That would be just like unbelievably irresponsible, and in no way good for the franchise. So Ron is in many ways in the same situation he was in Carolina when Tepper took over. Like, he's gonna get a chance to talk to this new owner and see what happens, and the owner will make a decision next fall or next winter based off of year 4 to see if they want to ride it out for year 5. I think year 5 is, I would say that's a 50-50 proposition, because that's the nature of new ownership. So that's that part.
Yeah, but that's just before we go to that.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like what I thought, even coming into this season. I just couldn't see where Ron would Dan would have made a decision during the season, after the season, to fire Ron Rivera. I just don't think where we are.
Also, Dan doesn't want to. Like, if Dan's the guy who's actually in charge, like, Dan loves Ron. In part because of what we're about to talk about. Like, Ron's seen as someone who is doing the right things. And when I say that doesn't mean he's not doing the right things, but like, Dan actually likes Ron. And by the way, if he makes the playoffs 2 of the first 3 years, even if it's with questionable records, like, that's a pretty good result. It's better than anybody else has done in Snyder's entire era. Is there another coach? We're talking about the history. Like, is there another coach in the last 26 years that's made 2 and 3 playoffs? I guess Gibbs in 05 and 07. If I'm doing that off the top of my head. But yeah, like, there's no other coach that I can think of that has made multiple playoff appearances under Dan Snyder. So,
Yeah, and with the new owners, my whole thought is like all of the rumors we've been getting of who might come in to possibly be the new owners is all business people. It's not no former players. It doesn't seem like it's not any fans and things like that.
Well, the amount of money you're going to need, with all due respect to all former players who have done well in business,
I got you. Yeah,
you need about five to 8 billion liquid to get in on this thing, which is not an amount of money that most people have.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. In terms of the other stuff, I want to make clear that like a lot of people reacted to a tweet. I talk 25 hours a week into microphones about this team. And, I spent one segment on this yesterday. So like the proportionality here always gets warped by Twitter, and that's the nature of Twitter. I should know better by now, but here we are. With that said, we're also talking about cultural issues here, and not just culture, like the culture of the Commanders franchise, but like larger societal cultural issues and the general apathy that most, frankly, men have towards workplace abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment is one misplaced based on statistics. Like you are much more likely as a man to actually get sexually harassed than you are to be falsely accused. Yet most men would react the other way, be like, oh, these women are doing X, Y, and Z. And it's like, actually, that's not how this works at all. And then they're generally apathetic towards these things because it gets in the way of the thing they like, the football. And I wish that we would stop doing that, because it would actually create a different incentive structure for people to behave better. And so while I don't really have like a huge problem with Ron and what he said yesterday, I do think being like, I like when this stuff comes up because it's a rallying point for our football teams. That's the part I found a little gross, to use the term I used on Twitter that a lot of people took exception with. Mm-hmm. And I don't really feel like that's that controversial. Like I get what he's saying, and I think it's more lazy than it is malicious. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying he's like excited about it, but like being more careful with our words will help actually change not just the culture of that franchise, which he has done a lot to change and deserves that credit, but will help change the discussions that we're all having, that you and I are having right now, that Twitter is having, that men specifically are having with each other around the world, that can make this place that we all inhabit less hellacious for women. And like, if that's something that is interesting to you, good, please start listening to the women who are saying the same thing. It shouldn't take me saying it and then people getting upset at me for us to be uncomfortable for a moment. And that's kind of my point is what Ron did like the worst offense in the world? Certainly on the long list of transgressions in this franchise? Absolutely not. And by no means am I saying it. Do I wish he would be more careful and continue to center the people who actually got hurt? Yes. And it also, I will say this last thing, Deuce, when people are like, oh, how would he, you came up with this, because people are like, what would you say? And I typed up a follow-up tweet. And it's like, oh, well, that's a carefully constructed answer. No, it wasn't. It was something I came up with in 20 seconds off the top of my head. And they have known that Ron Rivera was going to meet with the media and probably take this question on since the congressional report came out last week. That's a bad job preparing him and for Ron preparing himself for that question. They actually have the PR professionals who, by the way, do a really good job on the football side of things. I think the Commanders' PR staff on the football side is excellent. I think their PR staff on the other stuff, working with Snyder's lawyers and everything, is abysmal. And so Ron, just say like, oh, he wasn't prepared. Well, that's actually not a defense of Ron. That's an indictment of Ron and an indictment of the organization, because everyone should have known that question was coming. But to the larger point, just saying like, hey, we continue to have sympathy for the victims here. We're focused on football. That's my job. And I'm going to stick to football. Like, how hard is it for that to say? And I wish they would do that instead of being like, I'm excited we have a rallying point for our football team, because it makes the other stuff seem not important in a way that's not great.
But do you think like, and I've read some of the tweets and obviously the report, but sometimes like when we think about how the media reacts to certain things that Ron says, the way that he answered the question, do you think it deserved, or for you to come and to say that it was like what you kind of talked about it being gross, right? But when I read it, it didn't come off that way. And this is some of the things that we talked about in the beginning, and how we perceive things, how we interpret things that comes out. So as far as some people like me that think that it wasn't gross as it may have seemed to the way you interpret it, is the flip side of it. Can you see where that the madness of of the reaction to your tweets came off?
Yeah, I mean,
tweets.
I understand it. I understand it, but I'd also encourage anyone to like look who retweeted and liked my tweet. And it's the people who like Megan Imbert and Melanie Coburn who were in the center of this. And I'm always thinking of it through their lens. If I was them, and remember this answer comes on the same day that their attorney releases this letter talking about how incredibly humiliated and pained they were by the GOP's release of those photos. So like, this is happening simultaneously. This is all happening within the same ecosystem. And so when I think of these issues, I'm thinking about the people who have been hurt, who have been traumatized, as opposed to, and I'm prioritizing how they feel over someone who's like, I don't care. I just want football. And it's like, well, these people were working in an organization to give you football and they were traumatized. So we should care about them. And that's where I come at it. I understand that's not everybody's perspective. And I understand why people, I probably in hindsight would have used a different word because that word gross is so charged. And again, like I've been on Twitter long enough. I should know better that it was because what it's actually doing is obscuring my point instead of making it, which is generally speaking, we should do better on these issues. This is not the biggest deal.
Do you sit back and say, man, these walls just need something? Feel like it's time to freshen up your place with something new? If your answer is yes, then it's time to call Rob of Lewis Paints Plus, the accent wall expert. Rob will even give you a free estimate on how he can transform those boring walls in your home. To book today, call 240-418-5241 or reach out on Instagram at Lewis Paints Plus. And for 10% off, tell him Red Zone sent you.
So yeah, I mean, that's where my perspective is like, I understand people are looking at this as entertainment. People are looking at this as a thing that's been in their family for generations. It means a lot to them. It's all the things that we were talking about earlier and trying to understand the audience. I understand it, but at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, like, what's the most important thing? Like life is about actually looking at it in terms of priorities. And my priority is always going to be trying to stand up for folks that are marginalized in some way. And in this space, that is the women and frankly, some men too. It's not all women who got hurt in that workplace in a variety of ways. And so that's why I try to be consistent about speaking up in that way. But at the same time, I think it's also on me to sometimes not turn the temperature down a little bit, but make sure I'm more careful with how I say that so that folks who might disagree but would be open to agreeing aren't immediately turned off by the language. And so that's the tough part about being a communicator, especially in a world that prioritizes takes. The stronger the take, like the more outlandish you are. Like Stephen A. Smith doesn't get paid to be tepid. And I think, there are times where I'm like, man, I could just go ham all the time and maybe I'd make a lot more money doing this. But I think it's better to be responsible. And sometimes you don't get it exactly right, but that's where I'm coming from. And that's where I would say we can all look at ourselves and try to do a little bit better so that the atmosphere changes and these types of things don't happen again.
And that's the thing that I agree with is where it comes to the understanding exactly what went wrong, right? Exactly how these people that was treated wrongly, what they're going through and trying to understand what they have gone through. But then it comes to a point where, right, it's trying to separate that from football, separate that part of the organization from this new part of the organization. It's like the only thing that we can, that like for me, that I'm privy to or that I have an understanding of, everything that was in the old building is gone except for the Snyders, right? And the changes that have been made since then, we get to a point where when the negative stuff comes out, like for instance, like what happened with Ron and his comments, those things are magnified and Ron is not magnified for what he and everyone else and Jason and those people have done in that building since then to try to make where we are now and where we're looking to go better. At the same time, still understanding that these things still are around the building, even if it's just wind around the building. They're still there.
Yeah. And so I would say there's a couple things to consider there. One is the idea of accountability, right? Like, has the organization actually been held accountable? Because these things were systemic in a lot of ways. And yes, they've rooted out a lot of the people who did them. But a lot of people still don't feel like there's actually been accountability. And to just move on is very unsatisfying for the people who were hurt. And so I would say that's part of it. The other thing is like, are you familiar with the term sports washing? It's come up around a lot around the World Cup recently.
No.
Okay. So basically what sports washing is the idea that you use sports to kind of wash away other transgressions.
I figured that's what it was. But
it's pretty intuitive term. So around Qatar, a country that has a terrible human rights record where homosexuality is illegal and punishable by incredibly severe punishment, where there's been all kinds of, 6,500 migrant workers died building the stadiums that we are watching on television for the World Cup. Quite obviously, that should have, like, when the first person died, they should have stopped and been like, we should not be going here. It should have never gone there in the first place. There was a lot of corruption. But the idea was Qatar wanted the World Cup so that people could be like, oh, wow, look how amazing Qatar is. It's beautiful. We should all go to Doha on vacation. And they paid like David Beckham millions of dollars to come take Instagram photos and be like, look at me with my family on vacation in Doha. And the idea is that the sports stuff gives credibility to kind of wipe away, or that these are serious people, and that it wipes away the other transgressions. And while we're talking about a much smaller scale here, and we're not talking like geopolitics, that's my fear when we're just like, oh, Ron's exempt, Jason is exempt, we're just moving on. It's like, whoa. You want to move on, but you haven't fully acknowledged what happened. And until you get that acknowledgement and that accountability, I don't think it's actually fair to move on, which is why, what I said, when people were like, what should Ron have said? And my answer was, we continue to have sympathy for the victims. I'm obviously focused right now on the Giants game this weekend, and I'm just going to keep my answers to there. It's a way to both acknowledge, like, hey, yeah, bad stuff happens. I'm not mitigating it, but that's not where I am right now. And I think that is much more empathetic, much more, I don't even know the best word for it. It's just better language. I'll just simplify it. It's just better language that creates a more inviting and accountable atmosphere and culture, compared to just constantly moving on. When moving on from some of the details of like what happened under the old building was exactly what happened. Like, a coach gets accused of something, you're like, oh, well, he can help us win games, so move on. Like it's making sure that kind of stuff never happens. Not that it's necessarily happening right now, but don't create an atmosphere where someone thinks they could, where a bad actor can be like, yeah, as long as I help them win, we're going to be fine. And so you can do both too, right? Like, Ron Rivera's won a lot of games in his career. He made a Super Bowl in Carolina. A lot of other organizations have won a lot of games without bad stuff happening in their organization. They don't have to have bad stuff happen. So you can be responsible, have a good culture, and also win football games. And I think that's the other part too, is some people almost posit it as a choice. Like, you can't do both. That's not to say Ron isn't doing a good job as a football coach. I just would like him to also, if he's going to be Mr. Culture, like, let's do better with the culture. And not that he's doing a bad job, but let's strive to improve. And here's an area where you could, in my opinion, improve
on how he handles the past.
Well, I think it's just setting an example, right? It's like, this is not just we're better. Like, the bar is not committing sexual harassment in the workplace. Like, that's a no, duh.
Yeah,
right. But like, if they're going to go out there, and especially like, I'll bring Jason in on this one. Jason loves to be like, oh, we got other organizations asking us how we're doing it because we're such a model organization. Dan's and his testimony is like, oh, we're an A+ organization. We're the model. That's not the model. The model demands better leadership. Leadership requires doing things from the front in a way that can be uncomfortable for people. And like, they are doing the minimum, claiming they are leaders. And I think that's some of the disconnect too, is I'm trying to hold them to their standard and they're not really reaching that. And look, I also say this, dudes, I want to back up a second, because now I feel like I sound like I'm on a high horse a little bit. Like, I've done a lot of research in this space, going back years and years, like covering Greg Hardy in Dallas, for instance. When we talked about my time down there, I was there when they signed Greg Hardy, and I went incredibly hard on the Cowboys for that, and was doing a lot of research around whether at that, with Hardy, it was sexual assault and domestic violence. You also have sexual harassment. That is the key point in this. Like, my wife works extensively in this space as well, with a really great organization called Set the Expectation. Like, I have learned a lot about these issues. And so what I'm saying, I am merely a messenger in that way of saying, like, here's what the experts are saying about this. And if the football team, if the Venn diagram is like football team and people that care are trying to do better around, these issues, like, we got to meet somewhere in the middle. They don't get to operate one way over here and be like, oh, we're doing better. And then the experts being like, this is how you do better. And there's no overlap. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. It's not like a morality high horse of like, oh, I'm better than anyone. It's like, hey, if you're actually interested, which I think most people are, right? Like, most people are good-hearted and like would actually like to see better for people, don't want to see people get hurt, but they're uncomfortable with actually going there and saying the things and doing the things, getting out of their own comfort zone, maybe acknowledging some unconscious bias or whatever it may be in their own life, or some things that they didn't even realize were hurting people. And are you willing to, and I'll admit, like, I've done things in the past where I'm like, oh, now with the hindsight, like, yeah, that was dumb. I shouldn't have done that. I could have done better there. And so being willing to like step up and have those uncomfortable conversations and really make people think about what kind of atmosphere and culture are we creating, I think is uncomfortable. It's hard. It's going to come with some pushback, but ultimately, if we want to achieve that goal, it's worth it.
Do you think the stench will ever leave this organization? What will take for that to happen?
Dan to sell, and the Snyders to be gone. I actually do think it's that simple. Our Ron and Jason, have they I also, like, I'll say this for those two, like, I don't envy them. They've got to do what they're doing without ticking off him, right? Or ticking off Tanya. So they're in a bit of a box, and especially because Dan and Tanya have been so aggressive in their rhetoric via their lawyers, they're in a tough spot. Which is why, if those two leave, specifically, obviously Dan, but Tanya as well, like, Tanya is the woman who is married to Dan and is running this team. I think they can reset. If I was them, I would also look at changing the name again, because that's another way.
Boy.
I think.
Nope, we don't have enough time for that.
We don't have enough time for that. But like,
we don't have enough time for that today.
2027, open a new stadium, have a new name, completely start over.
But one of the things I just pray is that if the sale does happen, the coverage around what did happen just don't automatically stops.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead and finish. Sorry.
No, that was it. Cause I just want is the same amount of energy that's putting to it now, while the Snyders are still owners, that same energy should still be in place once they sell.
100%. For a second, I thought you were going to go the other way, and I was like, "Well, no, don't let it stop." No, it should. And what I was going to say, though, to add on to your point, which is 100% correct, just because they're gone again doesn't mean there's accountability, doesn't mean there's justice, and doesn't mean that we should forget. Because just moving on doesn't make the changes necessary on the cultural, societal level that this doesn't happen again. And yeah, it's going to be annoying for fans who just want it to go away, but what actually makes these things go away is to be able to look back and be like, yeah, terrible stuff happened, and people stood up and did enough to turn in another direction so that it doesn't happen again.
I agree. So thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate you taking the time today. I know your time is very valuable, and for you to spend some of it with us, we greatly appreciate it.
You got it, man. I really enjoy this, and I appreciate you having this discussion here at the end.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is Craig Hoffman, Team 980 Take Command podcast. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Craig. Hopefully we can do this again.
Absolutely, Deuce. Let me know.
Yep. Thank you all out there for watching. Thank you for listening. This is Red Zone in the Lab podcast. I am Deuce. One beat, one sound, one heart, one love.
Thank you for listening to Red Zone in the Lab podcast. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Red Zone in the Lab. And you can download our podcast at Spotify, iTunes, and Podbean. And please visit our website at redzoneinTheLab.com. Thank you.